Welcome to Retech, and today we're going to cover the Sharp MZ700 series. And if you watch my previous video, you'll have seen this little machine had to have a bit of a repair, but now it's working fine, as you can see here, and it's a good little machine. In fact, I've had so much fun with this Sharp MZ700 over the past day or so, just basically reacquainting myself with it, because it's such a quirky machine. This one's not the best. I mean, it's physically it's all right. It's a bit yellow. The keys are not as bright as they should be on the blues, etc., but it works really well, and it's survived 40 years. These machines were brought out in Japan in 1982 and were followed fairly shortly afterwards in 1983 for the rest of the world. So they've been out and about in the wild since 1982, and they're actually all right. They're very different in looks. The modular system that they're built around is very good. It's very novel for the time. You've basically got a choice of machines, and they range from the basic MZ700 series, which doesn't have a cassette, doesn't have a plotter, etc., and it's just the computer itself. Or you've got this model, which is the middle ground model, which has a cassette drive here, which I've replaced with an SD drive to make it a bit more convenient. And it doesn't have the plotter, but this one has underneath this cover a Centronics interface for full-sized printers, and it basically works really well. So all you need to do is just lift the cap, pull the cable out, plug it into your Centronics printer, and then off you go again. So they were very versatile machines. They had a full-size keyboard, which was very nice. It was very nice to use, very nice to type on. Now, as you can see, we've got Pac-Man running on here, and it's been running for quite some time now, and I've been very pleased with it, and I've had a bit of fun on it. It's not the best port in the world, but you know, it does its job, and it does it okay. And it runs a lot better than you'd think it would, but they kind of, to me, feel a little bit like a colourful ZX81, and I'll explain that as we go along. And this is the MZ700 as depicted when it was launched in Japan in 1982, and as you can see, there are slight differences to the appearance of the model, but you know, nothing out of the ordinary. And I believe the Japanese model was a very almost white in colour instead of a cream version that we got in Europe and almost certainly the rest of the world. Now, you have your cassette recorder and a printer option. Now, mine doesn't come with a printer, but inside of the cover where the printer is on here, on my model, I have a Centronics interface which has a cable which you can on-call and plug into a Centronics printer. But as you can see here, the MZ700 was part of a family from the 700, the 3500, the 2000, the 80 as well, which came along, you know, roughly in the same time period. So the specs of the MZ700, well, first off, it was quite a pricey machine, about £250, and that didn't even come with a cassette recorder or anything. It was just the base machine. The 721, which is the one I have here, this is a little bit more pricey because it kind of gets pitched in between the 711 and the 731, which had the plotter for £420. But you know, you can see that they're virtually the same machine. It has a full stroke 69 key keyboard, which is actually quite nice, with a separate cursor key on the right hand side. And it was a Z80A compatible. It was literally the Sharp's own version, which was the LH0080, and it ran at 4 megahertz. It came with 64 kilobytes of RAM, which was quite good in kind of 1982 when it was originally launched in Japan, and it wasn't particularly a games machine, because it only had two text modes, 40 by 25 for text and 50 by 80 for graphics. It had no true graphics, it was all character graphics, and the sound was kind of better than the ZX Spectrum at the time. It was a single channel, 3 octaves, but it was a proper speaker rather than the little piezo speaker that was used in the ZX Spectrum. But they were kind of on par with each other, really, technically. It could also run CPM and have an optional floppy disk drive unit. Okay, so as you can see, the specs weren't groundbreaking. As I said, they were quirky. It was a Z80 compatible processor that was on these machines. It wasn't a genuine Z80, but you know, it did its job. It was 100% compatible, and you know, you wouldn't know the difference if you had one running side by side. And I'm kind of almost certain you should be able to drop in a standard Z80 if you should ever need to into one of these machines, maybe with a few kind of tweaks to make it 100% compatible with the board. But you know, hopefully it'll never come to that. But they were very quirky designed machines. As I said, they didn't have any graphics in that sense of the word, in the same vein as a ZX Spectrum or a Commodore 64. What they did have was a character graphic set, very similar to the ZX81 and Commodore PETSCII or PETASCII set, and this is how most of the graphics were made up on this machine. So it was quite limited as a games machine, although as you can see, it could play some nice games. It found a footing in more of the commercial market. I mean, the built-in little tiny plotter that was on here was probably all right for certain applications, but you couldn't really write a novel on it. That's why this one was fitted with a Centronics interface and a Centronics cable under this cover instead of a plotter. But as I said, these are very quirky. They are well built, well constructed, look nice, nice to use, very weighty, very hefty machines, and very well put together. But when I first saw one of these Sharp MZs in a computer store back in the early 1980s, I was struggling to find a place for this machine, and it was the same for the HX10, which came along as a portable computer, but virtually the kind of world's first laptop. Technically it was, but again, there was a couple of machines of the era which struggled to find a place, and I always thought this was one of them, although they sold very well. And it's the same as the HX10. It sold very, very well in commercial settings, and that was kind of more or less the case of where the Sharp MZ series of computers kind of fit, because the previous machine to that was the MZ80 and 80K, and you know, in comparison to this is leaps ahead. I mean, it's based on very similar technology. The actual motherboard on this is very sort of late 1970s in construction. There's a lot of resistors, a lot of capacitors, and a massive amount of components on board when you compare it to something like a C64 or a ZX Spectrum. So yeah, they weren't cutting edge, but they were very robust and very reliable, and that seems to be the kind of impression that most people who've had the good fortune to have these, or have these to repair and refurbish, or even back in the day had them to use as a commercial machine, kind of felt about these machines, and they have a very good following. But this machine is 40 years old, 40, and it's still in one piece, and the plastics are very good, the quality is very good. Everything about this machine is incredibly good, and I'm quite pleased that I managed to get hold of one, even though it has caused me one or two minor headaches, you know. But there again, it was a machine that was trying to find a commercial footing. When you think about commercial machines of the time, they'd just come out of the minis, the mini computer era, and the micros were trying to find a footing into that kind of business niche, and a lot of them did. But as for games, they kind of reminded me of a Color ZX81. Now if you have a look at some of these games, you'll kind of see what I mean. So the Sharp MZ700 wasn't really a games machine. The sound wasn't too bad, but it kind of appeared like a ZX81 with colour, to be honest, with its graphics. And you know, it wasn't really a games machine, so the easiest way to describe it was basically a ZX81 with colour, or maybe a Commodore PET with colour, because it used basically character graphics. It didn't have any true graphics modes whatsoever. And as you can see here, it's just a very good way of combining characters to make up the illusion of having some form of graphics. And this is more of my point. It just literally, if you turn this black and white, it would look like a ZX81 game. There'd be very little to choose between them. But you know, in saying that, there were still some quite good games which are very entertaining for the time, and you know, you can't knock the games community or the gamers community writing games for this machine, and they did quite well considering the machine's limitations, really. And even games like Pac-Man or Greedy Gremlins, you know, it works well. It's again character graphics, does quite good. You would be kind of hard pushed to realise it was character graphics if you kind of happened upon this system for the first time, but you know, at a closer look you will see how the blocks and the dots and even the little Pac-Man style character was made up. But yeah, it works well, and it's not a sluggish machine. As you can probably tell, they weren't the best at graphics. A lot of characters were used to make up shapes and, you know, trying to make them work, and that was very similar to a lot of computers of the time. This kind of struggled in the games arena, but it didn't mean it couldn't have some nice games. I mean, really, it does look like Pac-Man, and it kind of sounds like Pac-Man with its 3-voice sound system on here, but it wasn't a games machine overall. But if you want to see a full review on this machine, you look at one of my early videos on the Sharp MZ, and it gives you a bit more in-depth details of the ports and the specs, etc. But this machine was a very solid machine, and it did very, very well, and it spawned a lot of other machines. So yes, the Sharp MZ700 series is a worthy addition to your classic and vintage collection, or to use as a classic and vintage machine just to get a bit of a nostalgia kick from some of the early games. It's a fantastic little machine. It works fantastically well. It's very robust, and it's worth collecting. So I hope you enjoyed this, and I hope you'll subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I hope to see you soon. Thank you.